We Okay, here we go. Let's get into this shite, shall we? So, you're going to notice things are a little different. I had to completely do a whole new install of Windows on my machine to fix some problems, and everything crossed. It seems to have worked so far. Um, but it meant I had to completely redo some of my other stuff, like my screens, they all disappeared. Um, Stuff like that. So, anyway, um, we are finally getting back. So we're on chapter 11 of Red Harvest. Um, and let's see. Just because I'm curious, I'm insatiably curious. I think, yeah. Um, there's no extra junk at the end of this book like there are with a lot of them. So it's 80 pages and we're on page 23, 11 chapters in. How that works out, I don't know. Long pages is what that is. Long, wide pages. All right. Anyway, so we are on chapter 11 and it's called Mind Eraser, No Chaser. So, Rojo Trace, welcome to Marfa. I'm Miles Emmert. We were told you were coming. The silver-haired agricultural lab attendant stood with his hand extended. Trace paused just long enough to give it a perfunctory squeeze, his eyes already scanning the area, taking in everything at once as they walked across the landing bay. The ship he'd commandeered was a generic mid-sized star skiff, big enough for a crew of 8, small enough to escape scrutiny, retrofitted with ion engines and a Class 1 hyperdrive for long-range travel. He traveled alone. I want to see the research level. Of course, Emmert nodded. The incubation chamber is on B7. That's where your sister took care of the orchid. The lift was waiting. 10 minutes later, Emmert guided him between the rows of plants and vegetation, heading for the chamber's airlock. The panel hung open, and Trace looked in at the broken electronics equipment inside, squatting down to place both hands directly on the dirty, scratched surface of the chamber floor. As far as we can tell, Emmert said, Hestizo was. Trace cut him off with a gesture, not bothering to glance up. A flurry of activity surged through him. He heard Zoe's voice and saw the face of her attacker. It was a Whiffid, he realized, the biggest one he'd ever seen, yanking her and the orchid out of the chamber. Trace felt his sister's surprise blurring into pain as the blunt end of the Whiffid's spear slammed her in the head. He felt the blinding impact as she jerked back, slumping unconscious to the floor, the flower tumbling from her grasp. The bent down, hoisting her over his shoulder and grabbing the orchid at the same time before he turned and lumbered away. He came for the flower, Trace said. Emmert nodded. The Murakami orchid is renowned for its force abilities. It possesses power, but it requires a keeper, someone with an equally high midichlorian count to keep it fully alive. So this was obviously written after episode 1 came out. Was there anyone else in this part of the facility at the time? Just Wal Bennis, the lab director. Is he still unconscious? Emmert replied, in the back to tank. Our physicians estimate he will be awake in a day or so. We can't wait that long, Trace said. What about surveillance in the loading and landing facility? Our sensors recorded the arrival and departure of an unlicensed ship early this morning. Emmert glanced away abashed. It must have come in under some kind of cloaking device and managed to evade our detection, but we went back to the morning's footage and found this. He reached into the pocket of his lab smock and pulled out a data pad, thumbing it awake. Trace looked at the screen. It showed a shot of the main hangar below, centering on an oblong vessel that looked as if it had been grafted together from scrap. Despite its ungainly shape, or perhaps because of it, the ship had a canting, rough-hewn meanness, a crude bulk that defied anyone to get too close, for fear of whatever might have been waiting inside. There was a series of partially worn numbers and letters on the side of the hull. "Can you enhance this image?" Trace said. Emmert pushed another button, magnifying the picture until Trace could read the name on the side, Miraka. "We haven't been able to fully identify the call numbers yet. That's because they've been scraped off just enough to make them illegible. It's an old smuggler's trick." Trace frowned a little. "You said it got through using some kind of cloaking device?" Emmert nodded. "Yes, but what's that?" Trace pointed at the screen, at a series of pale bluish-green discolorations along the Miraka's port side. The marks had an oddly phosphorescent glossiness, almost as if that portion of the ship's outer plating had been streaked with a layer of iridescent oil. "Carbon scoring?" "No," the Jedi Knight shook his head. "That's Thulian vapor residue. It's a galactic anomaly, a mixture of post-industrial airborne pollution and crystal fog. You only find it in about 3 places outside the mid-rim." Emmert gave him a blank look. "Have my ship ready," Trace said. "I'm leaving in 5 minutes." Within the hour, he'd confirmed his suspicion. The nearest Thulian cloud formations in existence cast a permanent shadow over Quen, a dreary post-industrial outpost along the outermost borders of Hutt space. By day's end, Trace had landed there. The Quen space station was a polluted sprawl of docking bays, warehouses, and repair facilities, cantinas, and unlicensed gambling parlors. Without drawing undue attention, Trace walked through a dozen different establishments, talking to the pilots, fugitives, mechanics, and fringe dwellers that made up the station's population. He bought rounds of drinks, fighting his own impatience, and listened to long, seemingly pointless monologues from barflies who hadn't enjoyed such an attentive audience in years. In the end, it was a one-armed Bothan smuggler named Gree who told him what he needed to know: the former whereabouts of the Miraka's owner, a whipped bounty hunter who went by the name Tulk. "Haven't seen him around in a while," Gree said, after Trace had bought him a series of drinks, including a local favorite called a Mind Eraser, and crossed his one remaining palm with a stack of credits. "Word is that he picked up a pretty sweet gig, nobody knows what." Trace met the smuggler's gaze, holding it fast, feeling the force flow through him into the Bothan's mind, completing the task that the liquor had already begun. "Did he say anything about a flower?" A Gree's face went smooth, all reluctance draining away from his voice so that the words came easily. "Yeah, that's right. He was going after a flower. Tulk wasn't much of a talker, but he got liquored up one night and he started telling me about it." "Who hired him?" "A Sith Lord named Darth Scabarus." Trace felt a sudden coldness pass through him. "Located where?" "I don't know. A Sith Academy." Gree grimaced a little, struggling with the memory. "I want to say Oda Sir Foston?" He blinked. "Hey, you think I could get another drink?" But Trace was already gone. And that's the end of chapter 11. See, I told you they're kind of weird. They are arranged like chapters, but they're super short. So, 12, ingredient. Stepping out of the turbolift, Zoe felt her hope dwindling away. Escape was no longer an option, if it ever had been. The Whippet had led her through the ruins of the academy, passing a few Sith students and masters who had stared openly at them, their faces darkened with anger and determination. If the Orchid registered any of this, it said nothing. It was mid-afternoon when they reached the tower. An HK droid had met them at the entryway. It confirmed Tulk's identity with a retinal scan that left the Whippet blinking and wiping his eyes in annoyance, and escorted them through. The turbolift had sucked them upward and dispensed them here, into this room. For a moment, Zoe could only stare at it. A laboratory like nothing she'd ever encountered in years of research sprawled out to fill the space in front of her. She could hear small things shifting and moving in the corners. It seemed in some horrible way to be an insidious dark analog of the plant lab on Marfa, its instruments designed not to foster life but to inflict and sustain dosages of pain on whatever might still be alive here. There was something rustling in a cage in the shadows, making little smacking noises with its mouth. "Do you have it?" With an involuntary breath of surprise, Zoe turned and looked back. In the center of the lab, a tall man in a dark robe stood watching them, his face a chiseled amalgam of shadow and bone, the cheek structure cruelly sharp, the hollows of his eyes like the sockets of a skull. Zoe felt a thin wire of fear probe downward through her chest and into the pit of her stomach, where it dangled, twitching in the darkness. She thought of the name that Tulk had mentioned on their way here, Darth Scabrous. The Sith Lord was staring at her, his expression inscrutable, although the raw intensity in his stare was unmistakable. It was as if he was looking at something that he wanted simultaneously to possess and to destroy. Without a word, the Whiffid took the orchid from Zoe's hand. He walked over to where the Sith Lord stood and held the flower out to him. "This is it." Darth Scabrous took the flower, giving it only the most cursory of glances, before returning his attention to Zoe. There was a glimmer in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Tulk stood waiting. "My money?" he said. If the Sith Lord heard him, he showed no sign. He was still staring at Zoe. "Her name is Hestizo Trace," the Whiffid said. She's the orchid's keeper. It needs her to survive," Scabrous said. "I know. That's how I knew you were bringing me the genuine article." He reached up and touched her face, his gloved hand cold against her cheek, like leather wrapped around an iron rod. "It was the one piece of information that I withheld about the orchid." "Then our business here is finished," Tulk said. The Sith Lord nodded. "My droid will pay you on the way out." The Whiffid nodded and walked away. "No!" Zoe called out after him, watching him go. "Wait!" She felt a steel band of panic tighten around her waist, pressing painfully inward, crowding out her breath. She heard his footfalls growing quieter down the long stone corridor, then the faint hydraulic whoosh as the lift doors opened and shut again. Then he was gone. The Sith Lord was still looking at her. A new silence spread out, seeming to fill the lab with a stinging mist of cold, dry air. Zoe was aware of the orchid, making anxious noises inside her mind, a soft, irregular click of nervous energy awakening to what might happen next. Although she knew she was the only one who could hear the sounds, she still felt an irrational impulse to hush it. "You are a Jedi," Scabrous said. "I am." She braced herself for his contempt, even rage, but the Sith Lord simply nodded as if he'd expected nothing less than her appearance here had in fact anticipated it. He reached out with one hand, not quite touching her, and she felt a certain heaviness underneath her left breast, as if his palm were pushing directly against the muscle of her heart. Then he lowered his hand and the pressure disappeared. He picked up the flower and carried it across the laboratory to the place where Zoe had heard the soft lip-smacking noises. What she saw inside made her stomach do a slow, nauseated barrel roll. The teenage boy in the cage was staring up at her with bright, unblinking, shoe-button eyes that bespoke nothing less than utter madness. On closer examination, Zoe saw a vine-like tangle of plastic tubes sprouting directly out from the young man's back, where they seemed to have been implanted into his spine and the base of his skull. Thick yellowish-red fluid crept sluggishly back and forth through the tubing. Zoe followed the lines across the floor to where they connected to an electronic pump with a large glass cylinder on top. A ghastly kind of circuit had been created here, she realized, a hybrid between human and machine. Scabrous made an adjustment to the pump. The fluid in the tubes moved faster. The boy went rigid and then began pounding his face against the cage over and over with a terrible kind of rhythmic intensity. The cage clanged with the crash of impact until the boy's face began to ooze blood, trickling scarlet from his nostrils and lips and the corners of his eyes. Still the boy did not stop. He was beating himself senseless, Zoe realized, trying to knock himself unconscious, or perhaps simply to kill himself, ending whatever torment was yet to come. Stop! Zoe stared back at Scabrous. What is this? Watch and see. What are you doing to him? Scabrous didn't answer. A moment later, he opened the top of the cylinder of reddish-yellow fluid and dropped the orchid inside. Okay, it switches gears here. Jura Ostrogoth witnessed the whole thing. He'd slipped inside the tower when the Whiffid had stepped out, not giving himself time to deliberate. Experience had taught him that such opportunities ought not to be wasted, and so he had gone. Ever since Nictor's disappearance the previous day, the Academy's rumor mill had been humming along at light speed about Darth Scabrous and what might be going on up in this lab. Earlier this morning, Jura had overheard Pergus Frode, a technician at the Academy's hangar, telling one of the other masters that Scabrous had had visitors, two bounty hunters who hadn't returned to their ship last night, and now Kindra had told Jura that she'd seen two more off-worlders, a Whiffid and a girl, heading into the tower. They were carrying something with them, Kindra said. Nobody knew what. It was only a matter of time until someone came out. After lightsaber training, Jura had gone off by himself and crouched down underneath the snow-encrusted stones of a half-collapsed ruin facing the tower's main entrance. The cold hadn't bothered him in the least. It had given him time to think, to clear his head. He had already decided that he wasn't going to spend his life worrying about being exposed by Scopik. If he was going to escape from underneath Scopik's thumb, he needed to change the game. Of course, he couldn't counterattack now, having just cornered him. Scopik would be expecting retribution, but once Jura found out what was happening inside the tower, he decided he would arrange a private meeting with the Zabrak. He would tell Scopik everything, confide in him, gain his trust, and when Scopik was off guard, gloating, Jura would... what? Kill him? Maybe. Or perhaps just humiliate him the way Scopik had humiliated Jura. In any case, things were about to be very different. How different? Jura could never have guessed 20 minutes earlier as he had slipped out of the turbolift and made his way across the open laboratory at the top of the tower. Candles and torches dotted the room with flickering, intermittent light. He'd been worried that he might be heard. The lift was hardly silent, but even before the doors opened, he'd heard someone screaming and a metallic crashing noise. The sound bounced off the windows and stone ceiling, blocking out everything else. Jura slunk through pools of shadow, making his way between the clusters of equipment until he could make out the unmistakable shape of Lord Scabrous and someone else, a girl, standing next to what looked like a caged animal, the source of the crashing and the screaming. Jura stopped again, narrowed his eyes, looked more closely. The caged animal was Nictor. Nictor was thrashing in his little prison, shrieking and writhing and blubbering out noises that sounded only slightly like words. There was blood running down his face, sticking and clinging to his cheeks as if he'd been sitting under a melting red candle. He was half naked, his exposed torso gleaming with sweat. But the worst were the tubes. They ran directly out of his back, long pipe-like conduits from his spine leading to a machine with a large transparent cylinder mounted on top. Scabrous was doing something to the machine, holding up some object that Jura couldn't identify, putting it inside the cylinder. The fluid inside it began roiling, changed color, became suddenly remarkably iridescent, pulsing through the tubes into Nictor's vertebrae. The screaming stopped. Jura watched Nictor collapse to the floor of the cage, motionless and silent, mouth half open, eyelids sagging. Now the only sound was the high, steady drone of a heart monitor in flatline. Jura let out the breath that he'd been holding in his lungs for the last 10 seconds. He didn't need to get any closer to see that Wim Nichter was dead. Zoe stared at the dead Sith student in the cage. His eyes were still open, glassy and lifeless. His mouth sagged, a bloody spit bubble clinging to the corner. A waxy pallor had already begun to spread over his cheeks, turning his skin a pale shade of gray. In her mind, the orchid was still screaming. She couldn't move, couldn't think. Nothing in her experience at the Marfa facility or before had prepared her for this. In the past 48 standard hours, the routines of her daily existence had become a blood-soaked travesty of reality. Her eyes flashed up at the glass cylinder where Scabrous had dropped the flower. It wasn't there anymore. The fluid seemed to have absorbed it, dissolving it into chunks, but she could still hear it, wherever it had gone, whatever had happened to it, crying out, begging her to do something, to help it, to stop the pain. Burning, Zoe, it's burning, it's burning. Scabrous was watching the cylinder. In the cage, the dead boy sat up. Okay, and that is the end of 12, so we'll jump into 13. And I think, what did I say I was going to do tonight? Um, through 14? Yeah. Okay. Dragon Teeth is the name of the 13th chapter. Jura never saw the door blow off the cage. It happened so quickly that the only thing his mind registered was the wire mesh flying across the lab, slamming into a vented power cell housing that protruded down from the ceiling. Metal struck metal with a flat, declarative clang that reminded him somehow of the sound of training blades clashing at the top of the temple. It was a noise that said, things have been put into motion, and whatever happens next, then there will be no going back. From his hiding place, Jura stared, crouched in the shadows as if welded to the spot. He saw Scabrous and the girl staring at the cage, neither one of them moving. The thing that crawled out of the cage wasn't Wim Nichter. It was draped in Nichter's skin, yes, and it wore some version of Nichter's face, but the eyes were ovals of smeared glass behind which pupils darted back and forth in the torchlight, like tiny black insects trapped inside a dirty bottle. It cranked its head to the right, and the yellow grin that wrinkled its lips back was unlike anything Jura had ever seen. Watching it, he felt himself melting inside, a breathless terror invading him, stripping away strength, reducing him to a shuddering pool of nerves. The intuitive voice of the Force was shouting at him now. Wrong, 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 but he couldn't seem to move. The Sith Lord gazed upon his creation. A terrible, prescient smile crept across his face. Nichter, he said, come to me. The thing shuffled another step forward, and Scabrous held out one hand, beckoning it forth like an animal. Yes, that's right. All at once, Nichter sprang forward with an entirely different kind of urgency. The tubes ripping out of its back, flailing free, leaving a row of raw-looking open wounds down its spine. Reddish yellow stuff splashed and spewed from the open tubes, spraying out into the air. From his hiding place, Jura saw the Sith Lord rear backwards, his arms in front of his face, as the thing that had once been Wim Nichter landed on top of him, and without hesitation sank its teeth into Scabrous' face. Scabrous swung one arm upward, and the thing flew back across the lab, its body reduced to a momentary blur, flailing into a tall rack of unused flasks and beakers not far from where Jura was still crouched. The rack exploded in a deafening cacophony of shattered glass, the thing tumbling over the floor, and Jura saw it push itself upright, its cheeks and forehead glittering with broken shards like dragon's teeth. Astringent smells of alcohol and ammonia and carbolic acid filled the air. Their Typos. Lots of typos. I don't know why. Filled the air. Jura saw the girl stand up and run for the turbo lift. She never looked back, not even as the doors sealed shut behind her. A roar of fury shook the chamber around him, loud enough that Jura felt it reverberating in the hollow of his chest. On the opposite side of the lab, Scabrous rose up. The right half of his face hung down in a pale, bloody flap. Above it, his eyes coruscated with anger so ferocious that it looked like something entirely different, something dangerously close to madness. The Sith Lord flung out his right hand, palm raised, in the direction of Nictor's corpse. The corpse jerked back again, tumbling like a thing on wires, and this time Jura Ostrogoth realized that he was the one crouched directly in its path. The realization came too late to save him. Nictor's corpse collided with him, knocking him off his feet and pounding the air out of his lungs, hurling both of them backward into one of the wide curved viewports that formed the tower's wall. Jura's final impression that the entire world was bursting apart around him in a brittle, deafening explosion was not altogether wrong. Then he fell. Okay, and that's the end of 13. So 14, the last one I'm going to do tonight. Um, Lusk. 14 is called Dropouts, by the way. Lusk. Rance Lusk stopped walking, paused a moment, and turned around. He had been on his way to the Academy's library for an afternoon of solitary meditation and study when the voice piped up behind him. It was Rat. The smaller, wiry-framed apprentice stood with both hands behind his back, gazing at him defiantly through the veil of falling, I'm sure that's falling, not tailing, snow. He looked radically different from the last time Lusk had seen him. Something changed in his posture, his bearing, the way he held his shoulders. Even his voice was bolder, more direct and confrontational. His eyes were polished stones, filled with a new and willful sense of determination. What do you want? You weren't at lightsaber practice this morning. Lusk didn't even bother to shrug, communicating his indifference solely through lack of expression. Everyone at the Academy knew that he only attended training sessions when he felt like it, when he wanted to test himself or prove a point to one of the masters. He took a step closer to Rat. They were all alone here behind the library's immense sprawl, the Academy's masters and students otherwise engaged in training or the rigors of midday study. Above them the tower stood, its shadows banded across the walkway like premature twilight, and it occurred to Lusk that this, too, might have been deliberate on Rat's part. Perhaps he had hoped Lord Scabrous might happen to be looking down. Well, what is it? Rat brought his hands out from behind his back, revealing what Lusk had already guessed would be there, a pair of training lightsabers glinting in the gray afternoon light. Does Blade Master Shockweth know that you ran off with two of his toys? Lusk asked. Rat didn't smile. The intensity of his expression never wavered. I challenge you. Cocking an incredulous eyebrow, Lusk asked, Now? Now. For an instant, certainly no longer, Lusk almost considered it. Then he shook his head. You don't want to do that. What are you afraid of? From you? Lusk blinked lackadaisically. Boredom, for a start. Then I'll be sure not to bore you, Rat said, and tossed one of the blades in Lusk's direction. Lusk caught it on a reflex, but lowered it to his side. I'm busy right now, he said. If you're determined to humiliate yourself, you'll have to do it publicly in front of the... Masters had been the last word of that sentence, but Lusk didn't get a chance to say it before Rat jumped at him, his feet hardly seeming to touch the ground. As opening salvos went, it was brutal but effective. A move whose grace would have been easier to admire if it hadn't ended with Rat's blade thwacking him across the chest, raising a hot streak of pain just below his collarbone. Lusk spun back, blade up, aware now that he was in this whether he wanted to be or not. And with Rat, he realized, it wouldn't be as simple as flattening him An example would need to be made, or else every student would be out here trying him. More than anything, Lusk felt a kind of exasperation. Hadn't Nictor been enough of a lesson? Was Rat suicidal or simply insane? He dived forward with his own blade, tensed for impact, but Rat wasn't where he'd been just a second before, seeming almost to have vanished in a cloud of snow. Lusk looked up. The other apprentice was somersaulting directly over him, spiraling down, and Lusk's instincts flung him out of the way a split second before Rat landed. Your Ataru has improved, Lusk grunted. You've been practicing. Pivoting hard, he brought his own blade around where he predicted Rat would be, and this time he was right. When Rat looked up, he found himself facing the tip of Lusk's blade. One stroke would finish the duel. Two would kill him. But there was another option. Now, Lusk said, meeting the other apprentice's stare and letting the force flow through him like an electric current, drop your blade. Rat held his mouth taut until the tendons stood out in his jaw. His arm quivered, but he didn't release the blade. Drop your blade, Lusk repeated. Still Rat didn't move. Lusk felt real anger taking hold of him, the kind of anger he rarely experienced. Without hesitation, he thrust his own blade at his opponent. If Rat was so determined to die like this, out here behind the library, then Lusk would oblige him. As he swung forward, he heard a window shatter overhead. Looking up, he saw something explode out of the top of the tower, momentarily arrayed in a glinting halo of broken glass. At first, Lusk thought it was some kind of alien species. It had too many arms and legs, and then he realized he was actually seeing two people, one wrapped around the other. The drop from the tower had to be 100 meters or more. They fell together, twisting midair, plummeting downward, slamming into the rocky, snow-covered walkway with a sickening, meaty crunch. Despite his reputation for toughness, Lusk had to look away. Gravity had made a meal of the corpses, contorting them into unfamiliar shapes. Broken bones punctured the flesh. One of them, a shirtless, blood-smeared sack of leaking viscera, lay at such an angle that Lusk could see its right eye protruding from the socket. Then it sat up. Lusk gaped at it, paralyzed by a dizzy wave of perfect awe. That's impossible, he thought. Nobody survives a fall like that. Nobody. His thought, whatever was left of it, broke off cleanly. The blood-smeared one was looking straight at him with its one good eye, a savage, inhuman smirk swimming over what remained of its face. Besides knocking the eye out, the fall had done something to its spine and shoulders, wrenched them around sideways, jamming the clavicles outward, shoving the bone of his arm up through the skin. It looked like a suit of flesh-colored clothes that had been recklessly draped on its hanger. Yet it was still moving. Its broken arms grabbed the other corpse, scooping it up in one flopping, eager gesture, and raked it towards its mouth. Raised it. I'm sure that's supposed to be raised. And that was when Lusk realized that behind the broken bones and layers of blood, he was looking at the mangled bodies of Wim Nictor and Jura Ostrogoth. The thing that had been Nictor bobbed its head and buried its teeth in the pulpy remains of Ostrogoth's face. Almost immediately, Lusk could hear the noises, a series of greedy, slobbering grunts. Ostrogoth, what was left of him, made no move to resist. "What is that?" Rat's voice was murmuring behind him. "What is that thing?" Lusk shook his head, stepping back. He had no idea what he'd just seen. This would all take time to process, to decide how he was going to fight it, or use it to his own advantage. But for the moment, he'd take it on its own terms. "You figure it out." Tossing his blade aside, Lusk turned on Rat and grabbed the smaller apprentice by the tunic with both hands, yanking him forward hard enough to snap Rat's teeth together like castanets. Rat's shock had left him vulnerable, an easy target. Rat's own blade slipped from his hand, clanking off rocks before it stuck in the new fallen snow. Wait, what are you doing? Rat asked. You can't. Lusk spun him around and shoved him backward as hard as possible in the direction of the slobbering, eating thing that was crouched over Jura Ostrogoth. Rat squealed, arms pinwheeling as if something in the air could hold him up. Almost immediately his feet tangled beneath him and he stumbled, staggered, slid, and finally fell, landing first on his knees and then on his back. The Nictor thing lifted its head. Fresh blood drizzled from its jaw, dripping off its lips. Its one functional eye shivered like a raw egg in a cup. It thrust Jura's corpse aside and devoted its full attention to Raat with the appetite of a creature being offered live meat. No, Raat was saying, scrambling upward, or trying to. No, no! Lusk turned away, legs already tense to run. The last thing he heard, the moment before he bolted into the library, was Raat's scream. And that is the end of 14. We're going to leave it there. Um, that'll put us at, well, that was all of 5 pages, 43 minutes. These are big pages. I don't know why they're so long, but anyway, um, 4 chapters, 5 pages. Go figure. Anyway, um, we'll pick up with 15 next time. And let's see who be about. Almost no one. Oh, Mr. Blitzer's on. Yeah, let's just. Oh, hello. I did not realize I was so into the book I didn't even see that I had a raid come in. So is that salty rated with 4 people? Thank you very much. I'm sorry. I was just ending the stream. I finished my 4 chapters for the night and was getting ready to call it. I just now saw you came in, so thank you very much for the raid. I wish I was doing a longer stream, but these reading streams are always a little short. But still, thank you very much for coming in. Um, but now I feel bad. I'm gonna have to do a little raid here. Take some of you over somewhere else. So how about we go over to Hot Dog Raw Dog? He's playing Final Fantasy IX. So I will start us over there, and I will see you there in just a couple minutes.